This is Women in Linux. Welcome to the Women in Linux podcast, exposing women to information and careers in technology.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining Women in Linux podcast with your hosts, Tamika Reed and Dee Parler. This is the first episode in our CTO series. And today we have joining us CTO of Zapier, Bryan Helmig.
I'm Bryan. I'm one of the co-founders of Zapier, which does kind of like integrations as a service. So a lot of like building blocks for like different Lego pieces, kind of on the internet to connect lots of SaaS apps. So you can imagine there's lots of weird things connecting everything. But having kind of been the one starting that, I had always been just writing a lot of the code, and the natural kind of transition for me was just kind of into the CTO role. And it actually took me a long time to even kind of wrap my head around what the CTO role was, because I've seen lots of different folks in different kind of positions or different kind of like flavors of CTO, because it's kind of a pretty fluid role. It could go anything from like being very like recruiting, hiring, people-oriented management side, all the way to, deeply technical, architecting some very complex piece of software, or building some very complex technical process. So it really runs the gamut. And I did a lot. I actually reached out to a ton of different CTOs around, mostly startup kind of CTOs, and found that the kind of response I got was like just really diverse. But there was a general kind of like thread through all of those, and that CTO tends to be a fairly technical role. That's someone who's writing code, someone who's deep in the system, trying to figure out some of the difficult business problems centered around engineering or technology. Whereas like on the other side, you have a VP of engineering, which traditionally is kind of like very people-focused, management-focused, hiring the right people, keeping those people happy, putting the processes in place that make the team scale, which is very, very difficult and important as well. But I kind of like landed on that as like two different routes you could go down. And we're still fairly small. We're about 55 people at Zapier. And about 18 or so of those are engineers. So I've definitely kind of like been on that trajectory of like a very like kind of technical CTO. But I think that kind of makes sense for the company we run, which is it's a SaaS company. We are software. Zapier is a large software organization. So having that kind of person running the technical side of things makes sense. Whereas I would be really interesting to kind of hear kind of your thoughts of what your like listeners are kind of experiences. But there's also, if you kind of scale that spectrum to the other direction, there's a lot of businesses out there whose core competency isn't necessarily tech. Maybe they're tech enabled, right? Maybe they're, they could be an organization that does a whole slew of different things, and kind of they're enabled by some of the tech or tech processes or infrastructure technology that they have. So that's I think kind of if we want to, I know we want to kind of get into skill sets and sort of the paths you can make. I think recognizing the sort of organization that you're in, is it like a deeply technical organization, or is it a tech-enabled organization, can really help kind of crystallize the sorts of skills that you need to have. And I'm certainly a lot more versed in the former. It's a deeply technical organization, but I'm happy to kind of shoot from the hip on the other side too.
All right, so a little background is I actually looked at I think you did not a meetup, but you did a video, I think with O'Reilly, I think it was, is where I saw it, but it was on YouTube, so it might have been on O'Reilly's channel. Don't really remember, but where you talked about becoming a CTO and what it was, right, and how you did do the interview. So that's kind of like where I got your name from, and I just hit you up on Twitter. And then so the flip side of that for me is where do you acquire those skill sets, right? So like here's a prime example. Hey, you work for a company and this company has 1 million customers, and you need to be able to do web scalability. You need to be able to do Kubernetes or something of that nature.
Sure.
Troubleshooting, so forth and so on, right? So how do you even get into a position where you can do something like that, where you're able to do that type of work, like a SRE or
Sure.
so for me, when I think CTO, I could even vouch and probably say 3 different things, right?
Uh-huh.
You have the CTO that's really technical but wants to leave that technical part and actually leave it to the tech people while they go out, and do, I guess, more like an evangelist role. Then I can hear the person that's the CTO that's actually it deep down inside, thinking about what's going to be our best solution, what's going to be our best route, what are our finances looking like, how can we make adjustments, where can we cut some costs at, where can we not cut the cost at, like this is like we just need this, that's just what it is.
Yeah.
And then I can also look at and see a CTO doing both.
Uh-huh.
Like I want to leave, but I really can't leave because I don't have anybody behind me that I'm grooming to even fill that role or that position in order for me to go out and get more business or so forth and so on. So you get kind of pigeonholed as well too. Mm-hmm. So that's why I say I see kind of 3 different routes. And then how can one groom others into that? Because it's like, when I look around, there's Carnegie Mellon, they have their CIO program, but there's no CTO program. There's no CTO, there's not even a conglomerate or group of people who are mentors for people to even become CTOs. So to me, that's how, if it's something I want to do, actually, is set up a network of people who are CTOs to groom others to become CTOs. But not only that, is building a network and also building your skill set as well too, because not every place is going to be the same. But I without looking around, I think there is some type of commonality that is needed. I don't know if it's 5 skill sets, I don't know if it's 10, but it has to be some type of commonality there.
Yeah.
Where you have, okay, well, look, here are the 10 basic skill sets you're gonna need, and then when you get there, you'll have to acquire these other things because it's really for that particular company. If all of that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're onto something there, because when I was talking to a bunch of different CTOs, I've even heard of particular roles that I never really envision as CTO, but that would be very important. Take a company like Amazon with AWS. Their CTO is always out there being like a super evangelist, basically about their tech. So that's like, you mentioned that a bit, like that evangelical sort of like preaching of like the platform, right? Like that's a huge part of that, and that's deeply important for their role, and that kind of makes sense for that CTO role, which is a totally different role from someone who maybe is diving down into some of the core internals of some sort of important software that might be critical to the business. And then I've also heard on the flip side, very, very sales heavy organizations doing large enterprise deals where the CTO is effectively like the biggest, baddest sales engineer, right? Like whenever you need to like go in and have a technical leader on a big deal, like it doesn't get better than the CTO comes in. So I've really heard all kinds of different kind of roles on that. So it is really hard to kind of pin down that specific one. But the one that I have the most experience with for sure is the SaaS software company that's kind of growing quick. And there's a couple things that are kind of going well for that. I know the easiest, not the easiest, probably the most difficult, but most like high probability like way is definitely that you're early in at the company. Maybe you founded it, and you're growing very, very quickly with the company at the same time. And I think that's probably the one that I would have the most like knowledge about. But I think you kind of touched on some other kind of important pieces where, regardless of kind of the organization that you're in, if they have some deep technical need or some problem, like really just getting your hands dirty and going right in there and trying to kind of solve that for them is probably one of the biggest things that you can do. I mean, like any company is going to be looking for those people on their team that really like step up and go to the next level. And as a CTO role, that's definitely one of the big kind of skills, that kind of fearlessness, right? To just like step in and say, oh wow, things are really on fire right now. Like I'm coming in, I'm going to help client clean this up. I'm going to get this going. Let's make this better. That kind of fearlessness is definitely, I think it's something you can practice. It's definitely like a skill set to just go in there and start swinging.
Right. And then, too, I was looking online earlier, and because I always have this question is, building relationships. So, one of the biggest things is building your brand, right? So, blogging, showing up at conferences, talking, speaking, podcasts, the whole nine, pretty much, you're out there, you're working, you're doing a lot of work to get to where you want to be, so you can be seen and your skill set can be seen, so you can do X, Y, and Z. But then on the flip side of that is, you're the person who's a security engineer / DevOps / SaaS guru, right? And so that's usually like a older person who's been in the industry for a while. So they've kind of morphed into this, this hodgepodge of skills. Mm-hmm. And so that person has probably, a lot of tenure and a lot of knowledge, but then they don't have a way to make that transition. They have relationships, but then they don't have that, that extra push or that extra, I guess, light at the end of the tunnel to say, hey, I want to hop over here, and I'm gonna take what I know that's true and test it, right? And I'm guaranteed this money, and then go dive into a startup with a possibility of, unless it has to be a very, very good idea. Right. And I can't, and I think that's kind of like where you started, correct? Like it was I read something where you posted on different forums, hey, how can we integrate WordPress with Meetup.com, and started that way. So basically, if you really want to look at it, you kind of were an evangelist when you started.
You're listening to Women in Linux.
I think that's a good point. Like you mentioned, like blogging, talking, speaking, to kind of get those relationships, and I think that's an amazing way to go about it, especially if that CTO role you want is that one that you're out there, you're speaking, you are the evangelical kind of like spokesperson for your technically focused company. Especially, you see this, I think, super commonly in dev-focused organizations. And you can kind of rattle off a bunch: GitHub, Heroku, lots of these sorts of startups that are coming up doing developer environments. Like there's lots of stuff where that evangelical sort of kind of slant, where you're out there, you're talking, you have a brand, would be super, super valuable. But on the flip side, if it's not necessarily that, maybe it's more of a technical, scale fast sort of organization that's kind of focusing towards maybe consumers or average businesses. Then maybe that evangelical side is a little less important. So instead of I would recommend, instead of blogging and speaking and all these other sort of events, which are totally valid if you want that path, but if you want the other path, I would suggest doing like writing lots of software and open sourcing it, like getting it out there for the world to see, like, wow, this person is really a talented engineer. And couple that with a little bit of like talking and blogging, just to show people that you can, get out there and experience and kind of be out among the people who are, your peers. That, and in conjunction with that, writing software, open sourcing it, being active in that community, I think would be probably more valuable. But again, I think it kind of goes back to this idea of, are you wanting to move into that leadership role at a public facing company that's doing a lot of evangelical stuff on the technical side, or more on this writing of software side? Because there's really both roles. And even to back up even just a smidge, there's not many companies out there that would have more. I mean, you can't really have more than one CTO, right? Like, so just by definition, if you like stick to that label and really want that label of CTO, it is going to be a lot more difficult. But there's a lot of different things that you can, that you could, geez, I wouldn't even know what the titles would be. But if you really like that speaking at conference thing, that dev evangelist sort of role, there's lots of like roles on that side that'll, will kind of like scratch that particular itch pretty well too. So even if it's an organization that maybe doesn't have that, super public facing CTO sort of role, it's growing fast and you have that opportunity, then maybe it makes more sense if your interests align more on the evangelist side to kind of go in that direction and leave the CTO role for someone who might be even more technical, wants to like really get into that nitty gritty of code. Because I think it really, really, really depends on that organization. Like what are their needs, and what's kind of the most optimized way to kind of fill that role and kind of grow the company on the tech side.
And then, so I know it's probably going to be hard for you to speak on this, but from a woman's perspective, how does she even go around about doing that, like building a relationship or setting her path? Like if you strip away, I guess, gender and come up with like 3 hard points, what would be the 3 hard points or three steps, I guess, along that path that you would say that you would need? Just over it.
Yeah, that is a difficult one. So I'm gonna try to just generalize them a bit. I would say the biggest piece of advice I would give is probably the same for anyone of any gender, is that really practice your core skill set of like writing code, being a highly technical person, and making that publicly visible. If that means, even it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be like crazy. Like I know a lot of folks that don't have a lot of like time outside of work to sort of do this. But if you kind of got a little bit of an itch and you want to try a new piece of tech, like spend that time sort of polishing it up, right? A lot of times I do a lot of hiring, and I see a lot of folks out there. I'll see a lot of like small, like little projects. If you dive deep into them, they're doing some really interesting stuff, but they just don't have that, little bit of polish sort of on the front, like a README, some of those, like a test suite that like visibly kind of in your face. That way you're like, oh, wow, this is tested. This is doing all the sort of best practices. I know whenever you're time crunched, it's hard to like devote the time to that sort of polish, but I have seen that work really, really well. And I think that's pretty like wide advice. I think that can apply to pretty much anyone. I would say try to position yourself in a place that is growing quickly. And that doesn't necessarily have to be at a company that is growing fast. Maybe it's in an existing company or an existing organization where one section is new, right? And it's a little untested, it's a little experimental. Kind of putting yourself out there and taking those sorts of risks, I think is really, really valuable. Again, I think that's applicable to anyone. There's new opportunities. You have to kind of put yourself out there to kind of take advantage of them. And then at the last one, let's see. I'm trying to think of a third one. I would say probably spend a lot of time kind of balancing this idea of what's like the technically best, and maybe it's just not technically best. Like you had mentioned previously, where you could cut costs or you can't cut costs. So these sorts of trade-offs, right? I guess we should say trade-offs. Like really kind of like vocalize those and share those and talk to people within your organization about the sorts of trade-offs you should be making. It's like, listen, there's this problem. I think it could become a bigger problem, but I know that we're really, really strapped over on this. So is there any way we could kind of like, make it very clear that you're making a trade-off here? It's like, oh, it's suboptimal under these circumstances, but I know because of X, we have to do something else. And just really making that a more visible process, because I know a lot of people tend to kind of make those decisions and just kind of stick with them, and they have good reasons for them. But really kind of like communicating those and getting feedback and like bringing the whole organization in where it's appropriate, I think is really great. So it's more like a teamwork thing and a communication thing at that point.
Okay. And so would you equate that to your soft skills that you need to be a good lead CTO or I guess, transitioning into a CTO? I'm like, what soft skills, or maybe even a soft skill book that you would recommend?
Soft skills. Yeah. So, for I don't know if I have a book for soft skills,
Okay.
but I think it's kind of like the sort of the active listener. Like a lot of times, listening is like really like trying to like get to the core of like the message. Just speaking like soft skills of things that I've noticed is there a lot of times people might have like opinions about something, and instead of like kind of consuming just the opinion or the surface level thought, like really trying to look behind the veil and say, okay, well, why is it that you want to do this, and kind of like understanding that, because at that level you can really get a deeper understanding of not just the the decision or the thought or the opinion, but also like kind of the person sort of behind the scenes that wants to do that. And as anyone knows who's worked with a big team, like you have this like beautiful tapestry of people, all these different opinions around how things should happen, and kind of that matrix of how they interact is like super complex. And until you really kind of understand a little bit of where people are coming from or some of the different kind of backgrounds and how they think about problems and the things that get them excited, it gets really hard to like kind of to be like super effective in this sort of leadership role. And you really kind of have both if you're going to try to go towards sort of the CTO route. You definitely have to have those hard skills, but you also need to be able to navigate around people. So that, and I think as we've talked about many of these different types of CTO roles, there's probably a spectrum of like how important they get in different scenarios, right? Like, I don't know, like being able to like get onto a stage and like talk about really great, cool product and be engaging. It's like, where does that lie on the soft skills spectrum, right? Like soft skills is more interpersonal. So I don't know. I think it's a really complex sort of topic for sure.
I'm sure. I have a few books that have been recommended on soft skills and so forth, but some of that's from a dev perspective. So I haven't dove off into those because I got recommended to that earlier. So I looked at like the first couple of chapters at a glance, but I haven't dove off into that.
You're listening to Women in Linux.
Final question. Because I don't want to hold you too long, but do you think there needs to be a mentorship program when we're discussing being a CTO, or do you think that's just impossible?
I certainly don't think it's impossible. I know the reason I went out and talked to I talked to probably a dozen like startup CTOs was just because there was so little information out there about it. Like, I mean, I was literally like going to like Wikipedia and reading like the CTO page. You know what I mean? Like it was, and there's not a lot of information in there, right? So,
right,
and especially a lot of the kind of information you get out there tends to like kind of skew towards bigger orgs, kind of the HBR, Harvard Business Review style stuff, and that certainly wasn't where we are and still aren't. So I needed a lot more like technical feedback about what worked and what didn't work for people. So I certainly think it would be great to have more mentorship around a CTO, because I just don't know if there's a lot of information out there, especially at the smaller, like less than 100 people size, when things are growing and you're trying to figure out how you're going to scale and operate and how you hire and, all these like sort of complex, parts of the business that are a little more meta than the other ones. And man, I just couldn't find much information about it. So I definitely think that would be super valuable.
Right. And then I think at that point, when it gets that complex, I think that's when most people start to sell. Like,
yeah, it could be.
Like, because I don't know I don't know how to scale this up. You
right.
already have people in place who can work on this. So you end up getting, swallowed up into a bigger company, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a
Right.
good thing
Definitely.
because you're the CTO, CEO, and you make your money, but it's a bad thing if you're employee number 56 and
Yeah.
you didn't get the stock offering. They stopped at 48, so
Right.
you
Yeah.
don't get the stock offering. So now your perspective changes because now you're not part of the smaller company, you're part of the bigger company. So now to be a CTO at that company is like really, really like far fetched to you because now you've been, swallowed up.
Right.
So
Yeah. That
so
that that's
that's that and that's what I typically see. And those that don't sell and wait too late to sell, their value goes down, or something happens where they have to sell, but it's not as much as it would have been before that. So it's like it's almost like you're playing Russian roulette with business.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily like black or white where you have to kind of sell if you because there's the other thing is I found is like if you get really great people around you. I mean, that's the other thing. Like when you have awesome folks that you're working with, it makes everything else so much easier, right? You can really kind of lean on people. So there's different opportunities to kind of step up into that leadership role. And I definitely think once you're at like that, if you're employee number like, 55 or whatever, it would be really difficult to kind of step into that CTO role because it's probably already figured out. Or if they're looking for someone who can kind of step into that role, they're looking for someone very established. So if you're like concerned is how do I break in? How do I break in? I think probably the best advice would be very good at your craft and go either start a company that's very, very hard, or slightly easier, go find a company that you really believe in, that you kind of feel like you gel with, that's growing quickly, right? And try to get in there in the first 10 or so people, and then just be Johnny on the spot, always like whatever problem there is, like you're gonna fix it. Like you're in there, you're kind of figuring out the hard, difficult problems with scaling the organization because it can be a lot of fun and it's really, really satisfying, but it's definitely a lot of work. But I think that would be kind of my rough advice is if you're thinking, oh, I really want to break into leadership of some sort of technical organization, either join kind of maybe it's a group that's inside the organization that is growing, that's a little bit split off, where you have a little more room, or look for that company that's a little bit smaller. It's a much, much easier way. And if your dream is to eventually get to be the head of, a big co, like doing that, that's a great stepping stone, right? Commonly the advice is to leap across jobs and look for those title bumps. And I think that's a pretty effective way to kind of step up versus, because if you're like employee number 56, you're probably too late for a chance at the CTO slot, most likely.
Yeah, and that's I guess that's for me. That's where I'm doing my research on is what are your skill sets that you do need. I know you mentioned make sure that you have your stuff out on GitHub, but what if you're a really, really good storage engineer, or you're really, really good at Kubernetes, but
Sure.
you have some coding background, or you write scripts, and that's not
Right.
really architecting a piece of software. That's just I'm automating the process, or I've written a script or something like that. So that's then how do you tell that person, hey, you better go over here and code, who's been in the game 5 years or something like
Right.
that, or 10 years or whatever. Go code, but this person works at Cisco and happens to know UCS and storage.
Sure.
Making that transition, I guess that person will fall under a VP of engineering, maybe, and doing that, but then grooming them to learn how to write code, and not necessarily write code, but write software, like, build out software, like find a need and architect that, like kind of like what Walmart Labs did with one ops. So something like that nature, like how do you build that out, So I think it's a lot of pieces. I still have to do some more research. I think it's just a lot of pieces that have to be put into play. But I do think that you probably do have to walk away from your position and then go into another position, like start something. But then that's, then we're talking about you're the CEO, CTO.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah, it can get tricky. You might get sucked into that CEO role. Yes.
Right.
But I think you're kind of like point of like maybe you got to start something. And I don't think you have to go so far as starting a company. You could start. I like how you mentioned kind of the one ops thing. There's probably some cool things that you could sort of put together that maybe a company might use, and maybe it's just an exercise for you. You could have your own like mini one ops, right? Alternative. Where you're just kind of hacking away on it locally, and you just open source, your code or your configuration for that, plus like have a nice, well thought out like README. Like that's like a massive step above someone else who maybe doesn't have that kind of out there. Because when you're trying to like, as you mentioned, relationships, whenever someone like Googles your name and like looks at what you're doing, like that's an impressive thing to like look at. Like, wow, they're like they're like they have opinions around how ops should be ran. They have opinions around all these things, and those are all like really exciting things, especially to someone who's kind of in the position that I'm sort of in as well, where I'm like trying to hire people or trying to find people to help scale an organization. You just want to find impressive people doing impressive things. So if you can find a way to make that public and to share that with the world in some way, GitHub's a really great way. I think that's a massive step up. And then from there, I think we talked before about relationships, just kind of keeping in touch with people you meet, like pick people's brain, like ask them out for a cup of coffee and say, hey, I'm doing X. I'm really curious about how you're doing that. And those little things, if you keep up, you just never know whether those sort of opportunities land. So I think starting something and just being impressive in your craft in some public way is probably going to get you a lot of the value.
I agree. So at the end, a little bit about who we are. I don't know if you got a chance to look us up, Women in Linux. We kind of started a nonprofit to get more women into the operation side, or I guess now you can say DevOps or SysOps, depending on how you want to look at it, what title you want to throw around there. Yep. But it's to get more women into that side of the house, hey, being able to architect a data center out, or understanding how to build out a cloud, from an OpenStack perspective, or whatever source you want to use. But it's getting women into that side of the house that we don't often hear about. And that's usually not introduced until you've been on the job for like maybe 5 or 6 years, and you're like, hey, what are you doing? You're like, hey, I'm a storage engineer. You're like, hey, how did you get into that? They didn't tell me about that in college.
Right.
So getting into that, like the high-end storage and understanding how to grab commodity hardware and make it work, versus you go out to Google Cloud and you just spin up your instance, or you go out to Amazon and spin up an instance, but nobody ever talks about how they built that part.
Right.
How did they get to that part?
Right.
How did they do that? What's the hardware behind that? How the pieces connected? How is the security connected behind that back end of operations, or DevOps, if you want to call it, is my focus.
Gotcha. Cool. Well, that's awesome. It sounds really, really cool, and I wish you all the best.
All right. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time as well.
Of course. Let me know if there's any other way I can help.
Thank you for tuning in to the Women in Linux podcast. Women in Linux is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization created to get women involved in the field of IT using Linux as a foundation. You can connect with Women in Linux through social media at Women in Linux on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. To join weekly meetups, go to meetups.com/Women in Linux. For more information and to connect with Women in Linux, go to www.womeninlinux.com.